Okay. Uh, Today I was asked to talk about glue-on shoes, and it was actually a surprisingly difficult topic considering that I use a lot of glue-on shoes. And part of the reason for that is that there's a huge range of experiences that farriers have using them. Some people use them frequently. They're looking for fine-tuned technical information. Other people are looking for more basic information. So I'm trying to put everything in there together and get a little bit of everything for people. So bear with me, and as Jeremy said, I'd be very happy to answer whatever questions I can, and if you have questions at the end, I'll see if I can pull up specific pictures and take it as a challenge, see if I can answer questions on the fly here. So this is the farrier shop, and my position at the University of Pennsylvania is not a new one. In fact, the farrier position there is as old as the vet school itself, which was started in 1893. One of the first people they hired was a farrier. In my background, I grew up with horses, but I went to farrier school in 1990, and ironically, I can pull up an editorial from the American Farrier Journal recounting the first farrier conference I attended, which was at Rochester Equine Clinic in New Hampshire, with one of the speakers, Bernie Chapman, had this great line: if anybody had told me that over 100 veterinarians and farriers would assemble to see if glue-on shoes really can be applied, I wouldn't have believed it. The reason I think this is important is this is a relatively new technology. We can discuss this. We have enough arguments about nail-on shoes, and we've had 2,000 years to figure out how those work. And we've really only had 25 to 30 years of real true working experiences with glue-on shoes, and we've really come quite a ways in a relatively short period of time with a relatively new technology. As a disclosure, I do work for the University of Pennsylvania, which has 3 patents in glue-on horseshoe technology, all of which were before my employment, but we still do have revenue that comes in to the hospital, a small amount of revenue that comes into the farrier shop through the use of glue-on shoes, although none of that is directly related to my use of shoes. I have no financial incentive to continue using shoes. And with that, I would say that the information that I'm going to present here today is relatively anecdotal. These are my observations and experiences with glue-on shoes. And everybody has a different experience. I mean, there are a lot of different shoes on the market. We're going to cover some of those. And I don't want, I'm just going to talk about what's worked for me, which isn't to say that there aren't other products that work equally well for other people. To put it in perspective, and I was trying to do some of the math on this, as best I can figure, I've been gluing shoes on for between 10 and 12 years, and I've probably averaged about 400 to 500 pair of glue-on shoes per year, which I guess in some way does make me a bit of an expert on this. If you figure that makes a good 4,000 or 5,000 pair of glue-on shoes in that time period. I've been told I make it look easy. There are a lot of little tricks to it, but it's a lot like everything else. It's a lot like nailing shoes on. The more you use them, the more comfortable you get with them, the more it becomes commonplace. Yeah, most of us don't even have to think when we're driving in a nail. These are actions that are second nature and decision-making processes. We don't have to figure out what nail goes with what shoe or in what size foot. They're pretty much automatic decisions, and that's really the way glue-on shoes have kind of become for me in some ways. There are, the first reason for using glue-on shoes is the obvious one, which is there's nowhere to put a nail, and that's how I started using it. I do think I found and kind of refined and been able to build on that some. So initially glue-on shoes for me were a means of last resort. You glue a shoe on when you physically don't have a place to nail a shoe. And I've changed my approach on that over years, and I found more and more applications where glue-on shoes seem to be a preferable alternative, albeit in my hands, compared to what I found in some applications for nail-on shoes. In the frequently asked questions here, this is one of the first ones that always comes up. Are glue-on shoes safe? Well, the answer to that is yes, that these adhesives have been around for a long time. And most of the adhesives that we're discussing here were not actually developed for use for glue-on shoes for horses, but they came as crossover products from other industries where they have been thoroughly examined and studied well. A couple of real basic rules: use in a well-ventilated area, and almost every barn constitutes a well-ventilated area. Avoid direct contact with skin. Most of the time we're using gloves on there to keep glue off of our skin anyway. and use some common sense. I can tell you what glue on shoes what glue tastes like, some of the acrylic adhesives, but that's not on purpose. These are the accidental things in there that happen a little bit from time to time. There are some people who seem to have more adverse reactions or more sensitivity to some of the fumes of the acrylic shoes, and there's an odor that goes along with some of the acrylic adhesives. But there are also, the same things really can apply to some of the urethane adhesives. I'll talk about those a little bit later, which, different types of adhesives. But odor in itself is not necessarily an indicator that something is either problematic or safe. So just things to keep in mind. The first question, the next question, are all adhesives the same? Well, the answer is no. They come in different categories. We have acrylics or polymethyl methacrylates, and here are a couple of trade names that these are marketed under. We also have a separate category, polyurethanes. The major player in there is Vettech with products like Superfast and Equibuild. And finally, the other main category are cyanoacrylates, and those are generally some of the early ones that we use, products like superglues. Now, I kind of point that out in the early side of things because the cyanoacrylates and the superglues kind of gave a bit of a reputation for glue on shoes, and I can't necessarily say that it was one that was great. It was, along with everyone else, I experienced the same problems. You glue a shoe on, you come back a week later, or you get a call from the owner a few days later that the shoe had come off. And part of the reason for that was that cyanoacrylates are not a great option for glue on shoes. They tend to be brittle, and horses' feet are constantly moving, and they tend to be very poor at resisting moisture infiltration, and horses live in a moisture-laden environment. So it was a relatively poor choice. Urethanes and acrylics have both proven to be dependable methods, dependable products for the use of applying shoes. There are nuances to using both. I'm going to focus a little bit on the acrylics because those are the products that I use most frequently, but keep in mind that there are a lot of different options out there, and we also have to keep in mind that different adhesives are designed to be used with different products, and you can't necessarily use a cyanoacrylate on a shoe that's designed for acrylic or acrylic on a shoe that's designed for urethane, or vice versa. There are specific products that are designed to be used with specific adhesives. So if all acrylics are, if all adhesives aren't the same, are all acrylic adhesives the same? And that's a bit of a trick question. The answer is no and yes. All of the acrylic adhesives that we see in this country, all are products of the same base company. They all come out of the same Philadelphia-based company. They are of different chemical formulations and different ratios. So even though we tend to lump them all together and say, hey, here are acrylic adhesives, all Equilox is not the same. All Grand Circuit products are not the same. And I think there are a little bit that we can learn out of that in terms of the differences between that. Some of the products that are out there are referred to as slow set adhesives. So we have slow set and fast set. Those tend to be a 10-to-1 mix ratio. And there are different times and places where you might find this to be preferable. If you're working in the northeast of the United States and you're working in January, you might want to pick the fast set because these are the setup time on these acrylics are definitely dependent upon the external temperature, the ambient temperature. In fact, the general rule, if something is listed as having a working time, if an acrylic adhesive has a working time of, say, 4 to 6 minutes, that's all designed to be at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. For every 10 degrees hotter than that, you can take 1 minute off of the set time. For every 10 degrees colder than that, you can add one minute to the set time. So these are things you have to keep in mind. If you're working in Wellington, Florida, in the hot months, you don't want to be using the fast set. I can't think of a situation where you'd want to use the fast set in that environment at that temperature. It's going to set up too fast. You're not going to have the time to do what you need to do. What I tend to use the most of is the 4-to-1 ratio, and this is it's a little bit more forgiving in the mix because your ratio is even, so or closer to even, so you have more mixture of accelerator and base product, and it tends to be thicker. It's not as it doesn't have as much sag, so I do a lot of hoof wall reconstructions, and this tends to hold in place better. It doesn't slide down the foot as you're putting a repair in place. I also work in an environmentally controlled shop, so I have less need to have temperature varying adhesives, and that makes my life a little bit easier. The first type of glue-on shoe that I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking is what's called the direct glue-on shoe. And it basically is what it looks like right here. What we have is a shoe. Basically butter up the bottom of the shoe with or without different spacers to make sure that you have a bond line thickness. You generally want to have at least an 1/8 of an inch of glue in between the shoe and the foot so that you have enough adhesive to hold both the shoe and glue to both the shoe and to the foot. We tend to use aluminum with this. There's actually a really good reason for that. If you try and, when you grind a shoe, you have to just take the shoe over the grinder and hit it so that you get rid of all the grease and all of the layers. With aluminum, oxidation occurs very quickly, and it occurs, as it occurs a couple of weeks later even, it's a very thin, organized layer of oxidation. When you talk about steel, the problem with steel is that you end up with 2 to 3 weeks after you apply the shoe, you end up with some ferrous oxide, which is very loosely attached to the base metal, and then it basically displaces the glue, and you bond it to the rust and not to the shoe itself, and the shoe falls off. So there's a little bit of a difficulty in gluing on steel shoes, and for that reason we tend to use products like aluminum, which have which are a bit more stable from an oxidation point of view, or products like ABS plastic, which is shown right here, or various polymers. It should be noted that not every polymer bonds well to acrylic adhesive, so there's a little bit of trial and error. Check with the manufacturer of a given polymer shoe before you know what adhesives it's designed for and what's supposed to be applied. There are a ton of shoes now that are manufactured specifically. This is an imprint shoe, which is a low forming. You essentially put it in hot water and it will form to the horse's foot. And then you can use an adhesive to bond to the horse's foot, so it forms directly to the hoof. Here's an EDSS shoe with side clips of aluminum, which can just be glued to the side of the foot. There's a Dowrick cuff over here, and an Ibex cuff shoe over here. They all work, and they all have their place. They're not what I use the majority of the time. The great majority of my work is with the Sigafoos shoe. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, the fabric cuff fits the hoof angle of every shape relatively easily, and I find that a lot of horses really appreciate having a urethane layer in there so it has some protection on the bottom of the foot. Another question that comes up a lot, is it dangerous? Is there potential for danger in terms of the heat that's applied to a horse's foot? Well, to answer this question in as real a way as possible, we used a cadaver limb. We attached temperature probes and inserted them at the layer of sensitive tissue under the hoof wall. So here you can see a couple of temperature probes, and we validated the position of that using a fluoroscopic image right here. We did the same thing down here using the solar view of the foot, so we could look at different ways of attaching the shoe. And a couple of things jumped out at this. The red line right here on the left is this is the temperature that was observed with an acrylic adhesive basically in a pot. So if you look at just a large mass of acrylic adhesive, a couple of ounces polymerizing at a time, it does get really hot. It actually comes and looks like it's around 64 degrees centigrade. Now that's hotter than you can hold in your hand, and definitely hotter than you would want to put over exposed tissue on a horse's foot. The good news is that with these adhesives and the way we use them, the amount of exotherm that's released is dependent upon the mass of the material you use and also the shape. So if you're using it in a long thin sheet, for instance, you don't have as much of an exotherm. If we looked at the temperatures that was using some of the cuff shoes that we used, if we looked at the temperatures that we observed on the outside of the foot, it was down to about 50 degrees centigrade, which is still hotter than is necessarily comfortable. But when we look at the temperatures that were observed on the inside of the hoof wall, we're looking at temperature changes that were about 5 or 6 degrees centigrade. Not enough, especially without the advantage of circulation helping to dissipate the foot in a cadaver limb, certainly not enough that we would expect that to cause a problem. Urethane temperatures, and with apologies, resizing this made my axis disappear right here. The urethane temperatures in a pot went up to about 75 to 80 degrees centigrade. The point with that is you have to be really careful about how you use these in certain situations. To put this in a bit of a context, we looked at the temperature changes that were occurred under the sole as a result of hot shoeing. So we took a shoe and brought it to a red heat and set it for about 5 seconds on the foot. And we got temperature changes of about 12 to 14 degrees with different probes in different locations, with different amount of sole thickness, and compared that to the the acrylic adhesive, where we only saw on the solar temperatures, again, about 5 or 6 degrees worth of change on the hoof wall. And without circulation, it helps to put it in a context. Is that a problem for a normal foot? Probably not if you're dealing with this foot over here. It's definitely has a potential for problem if we're using big extensions on a fold that has a really thin hoof capsule. And care should be taken that you don't have too thick a repair or have too much material going on the foot all at one time. It's also potentially a problem when we're dealing with defects on a foot, when we have big cavities that we're filling, or we don't have the benefit of having a thick hoof wall to help buffer and to control some of that heat. When we have a big defect like this, if you were to fill this with adhesive, there's just not enough protection and not enough spacing away from sensitive tissue. And I'll talk a little bit later about ways that we can avoid that. So is heat dangerous for the foot? It can be if it's not used properly. So here's a case study, and this is a little bit of a typical case that walks in the door. The history on this horse is it's a 5-year-old thoroughbred, formerly a thoroughbred racehorse. Now it was being purchased, and the owners wanted to make it a timber horse that would have a bit of a more taxing style on its foot, lifestyle on its foot. They weren't able to keep it sound once it got away from the racetrack. It had foot issues. They tried glue-on shoes, direct glue-on shoes, which didn't seem to work very well. They also pulled the shoes for the last few months. And again, this horse was really quite sore. It was about a 3 out of 5 lame on both front feet. And a lot of that was attributed to the quality of the hoof capsule. Radiographically, you can see pretty much another indication why. Not only do we have this dishing in the toe and this bit of a collapse in the foot right here, but we also have a really thin sole depth under the tip of the coffin bone. There's just not a lot of protection right there. And the heels are also, somebody's trying to protect some hoof mass. They're a bit reluctant to trim some of the heels down, but we have distortion in the heels in the form of long and underrun heels. So we have a foot that in a lot of ways, I wish I could say this was atypical, but this is pretty typical of the horses that walk in the door. We're having a lot of, essentially a collapse of the foot and a difficult time managing the hoof capsule. Now Jeff Reilly, I smiled when he said this in the last lecture. He used a reference of carving a wooden Indian from a block of wood. The trick is trying to carve and visualize in your mind what's ideal and take away everything that's not a wooden Indian. In this case, what I'm trying to do is similar to that. I'm trying to see a horse's foot. I'm looking at all the distortion that's present, and I'm actually trying to sculpt, if you will. You could call it trimming, but I think of it sometimes as sculpting. Trying to sculpt a normal foot, removing some of the distortion out of this foot, both in the heels, and you can see in this one we removed a lot of that dishing in the toe. The other thing that's kind of interesting of this, I keep some of these mats in my shop, and this horse was hard pressed. You couldn't really move him. If I took these mats and moved him over here, the horse would move over there and follow the mats. And that's a little bit of one of my litmus tests for when I think a horse is going to benefit from glue-on shoes. If you get the impression that their foot would benefit from being wrapped up in a big pillow for a few months, glue-on shoes are one of the things that I consider at that point. I'm going to play a video now that just kind of shows the process of gluing on a shoe. And I'm going to stop and pause this video at a couple of different points to explain a little bit of what I'm doing. I hope that's a helpful way of understanding a little bit of this process. I use the Equibond 4-to-1 adhesive, and I buy it in this tube because I can regulate how much material I'm putting out at a time. And I'm adding to it right now a little bit of a black dye. In terms of the black dye, I'll tell you, Sheffield's Tintol. You can buy it at most paint stores. It's an acrylic dye, and it'll save you a lot of money over the year and make clients happier if the color of the foot actually kind of matches the color of the horse. So there's no other benefit to the dye in here. Now what I'm doing right here, and this is actually one of the frequent areas they'll say people kind of mess up when they're working with glue-on shoes. Mixing the two parts together, in a sense, requires that the glue be in a viscous form early on. If you live in the Northeast and it's 10 below, put the glue in your truck for a period of time. Make sure that it's flowable before you start mixing it together. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a problem where you just don't end up with enough blending of your activators and your base material. The other thing that you want to do, and this is actually an interesting comment in here. I had some people from the company that actually make all the glue-on shoes. They came into our shop and they were concerned over the amount of air that I was incorporating into the adhesive right here while I was mixing everything together. And since then, I started using mixing tips more. I wish I could tell you I saw no difference, but I probably do see a little better attachment at this point. Now I'm moving over to the horse's foot. You'll notice I have a little bit of white tape wrapped around the coronary band. That's just there to provide some protection for the sensitive tissues on the foot in case any glue works up over that. And now what I'm doing is it's called wetting out the foot. When you're working with polymers, you want to make sure that all the surfaces that you're dealing with are covered and therefore a bit of protection. So I'm putting a thin layer of adhesive over the foot just to make sure that when the shoe goes on, that we're going to have great contact area between all the layers of fabric, which I'm saturating right now, and the outside of a horse's foot. Now with the Sigafoos shoe, there are 2 layers of fabric in here, and I'm taking care to make sure that I have really good saturation of all of those fabrics, all those layers of material. And I'm also making sure that I don't have any adhesive on the bottom of the foot. So there's no adhesive that's actually going between the shoe and the blue urethane pad, between the rim pad that's on there and the foot. I think that's important in this case because if you think back on the radiograph on this one, the horse just had very little sole depth. And a lot of the horses that I see, not only do they have a thin hoof wall, but a lot of the horses with a thin hoof wall are also experiencing a thin sole. And that's really not conducive to putting a hard glue on there to help hold everything in place. So I'm walking over the horse. You notice that my inside hand, in this case my left hand, does not have a glove on it. I'm setting the shoe on. I have one hand that's dedicated to getting dirty, and I keep a glove on that side. And now I'm just pressing down on the cuff and making sure that I've really taken a couple of minutes to make sure that I have that cuff well positioned on the foot. And now I'm using saran wrap. And the saran wrap is going to have a couple of different functions. One is it helps to position the shoe on the foot. It acts as a vapor barrier because this glue does not set up well in the presence of oxygen, the same point that the chemists made when they came in. That's one of the reasons if you just put a thin little skin layer on top of the foot, it doesn't set up and it'll always stay a little bit tacky. The surface layers will just stay a little bit tacky if you don't cover it with some sort of vapor barrier. It inhibits the moisture the oxygen in the air is going to inhibit some of your polymerization, so you're going to end up with a tacky layer over the surface. The other thing that you've learned over time, and farriers know this, we can use nails as we're nailing on a shoe to kind of push the shoe a little bit in one direction or another. We can move the shoe in very subtle directions. I can do the exact same thing with saran wrap as I'm putting it on. So I stop and check at different points, just kind of get a sense for if the shoe is where I want to see it positioned. So now I've just got the saran wrap in place, holding the horse behind the knee so he doesn't slam his foot down. And really that's it. Now the horse, I don't have to hold this foot up until the shoe dries. I can actually put it on the ground, and the saran wrap's going to keep that from shifting around. The only other step that I haven't really shown in here is I'll take the handle of my knife and I'll actually smooth out the contour. I'll just run my knife handle over the outside of the foot just to make sure that there aren't lumps and bumps in there, and also to make sure that I've gotten all the air bubbles out. There are no pockets that are trapped in there that are going to create a problem down the road. I leave that on for about, depending on how warm it is, I'll say it's somewhere around 6 or 7 minutes, or until I get bored, one or the other. Come back, and then I pick up the horse's foot right here, and I'm just going to cut all of the saran wrap off all in one piece. So this comes off in, I'll say normally comes off a little bit. I use a lot of saran wrap on this foot, and one of my standby lines is saran wrap is a lot cheaper than glue and glue-on shoes. I can go through a lot of saran wrap before I have to worry about having used too much. I'd rather have too much and have that held in place really tightly than to have the shoe shift around. So now I'm pulling off the saran wrap and the white tape that I put around the coronary band to protect it. Trim up a couple of loose edges on there, and that's it. It's a very simple process. I wish I could say it was actually really challenging. There's not a lot to this. It does take some getting used to. It does take a little bit of I guess a little bit of practice to make it, a bit of a refined process and make it aesthetically pleasing. But the shoes do stay on pretty well, and this horse actually got very comfortable very quickly and is now in training, hopefully towards his career as a timber horse, and hopefully it holds up well for that. Another question that I get asked a lot has to do with shoe removal. How do you take them off? In this case, what I've done is I've put my pull-offs way back behind the fabric, and I'm using a utility knife. And the trick in this is that you pull with your, in this case I'm pulling with my left hand to create a little bit of a space between the shoe and the foot, and I'm literally just cutting the shoe directly off of the foot. So I'm leaving the cuff on the foot, and just cutting until the shoe pops off. This has great lap strength. That is, you could pull that shoe off for, it would take a lot of force to get that shoe to pull directly off. But the shear strength is actually pretty reasonable, so that I can actually peel this off, almost like peeling an orange skin off of an orange. Another question that I get asked a lot: do adhesives soften the hoof wall? Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that glue-on shoes are perfect for every situation and that it's an amazing, wonderful thing for every animal. There probably are some downsides to this. If you look at the hydration gradient of a normal foot, there's more moisture at the layers of circulation, and it gets progressively dry as you move out. And that's normal. Most of the moisture that is present in horse's foot actually comes from the circulatory bed, and it evaporates and it gets drier as you move to the outer hoof wall. This is part of what gives hoof its plastic hoof quality. This is what allows it to move around without cracking and without suffering big defects. So it's actually a very helpful system in a horse, very well-designed aspect of a horse's foot. If we do things like put a glue-on shoe on the outside, I believe it's possible that we would trap some moisture in there and lose a little bit of that gradient, of that difference between the moisture content on the inner layers and the outer layers. I think the trick in also is appreciating that pads do the same thing, probably to a greater extent, because there's more moisture transpiration that occurs through the sole than what transpires through the outer hoof wall. So you probably do have an effect. We know pads, come back. You put pads on a soft foot, and after a few shoeings, it has the potential to make that foot a little bit softer. I believe the same thing could probably happen with the glue-on shoe. I also think there are other ways around it, using a partial cuff on there. If you're switching back to nail-on shoes, pull the cuff off, give it a couple of hours in the stall, and then come back and do it. And the foot will really have changed in characteristics over a short period of time. So there are ways of dealing with some of that. But I also believe that glue-on shoes help in the long term to maintain, if not preserve, or increase the integrity of the hoof capsule. So to show why I think that, this is a glue-on shoe on a horse. I put a rail on it. This is a system that we're using to try and quantify solar forces and farrier practices and how we can affect solar load distribution changes. So this is an in-shoe force measuring system. And just to show you a little bit of what it looks like, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Here's a horse walking with a sensor on its right front foot, and we can see different intensities of force, different amounts of, as well as a distribution of force over the solar surface of the foot. Red is high force areas, high pressure areas. Yellows are in between. Greens and blues moving down. You can see the scale over here on this side of the screen. So we can actually quantify the force and measure this at a really important juncture in my mind, which is in between the horse's hoof and the shoe, which gives us an ability to look at how our shoeing practices might influence the solar distribution. Okay, we can now break this down and we can look at it in different areas. So we can graph out the force on the outside of the foot versus the force on the inside of the foot. We can break it down into whatever area we'd like. This is a laminitic horse that we did some work on. This was actually a New Bolton Center research horse. And you can see she has rotation in both front feet. Cutting a little bit to the chase, I measured this as 8 degrees of rotation. Everybody's got their own way of measuring these a little bit. And this was the shoe I put on in the foot an hour later. Obviously, we didn't make this coffin bone push back into place. What we did was we rasped off all of the distorted foot to make it radiographically appear better. And the question we were asking is there the potential for downside in doing that? So here are some different methods that we can use of managing, if this white line right here represents where the shoe goes or where we're ideally positioning the shoe. And everybody can debate where ideal is, but we position the shoe in this place. We have a couple of different options in managing this dorsal hoof wall. One is we can leave it hanging over the front of the shoe. 2, we can square it off bluntly. And 3, we can blend in all of this distorted foot up to the coronary band. Well, what we did with this, and I have impression material that's domed on the bottom of the foot, what we did was to walk this horse and actually record this force in the area in front of the frog and inside of the shoe. So this is the sole in the front half of the shoe. And this is the way the force was represented for an average stride. And this was averaged out, I believe, over 8 strides, yes. Then we just came back and we squared the toe off. And you can see that I basically made this a partial cuff. I've cut a lot of the fabric out of the front of the foot so we can manipulate this, but I do this quite frequently in horses that don't have issues. I mean, we don't need the full cuff in order for this to stay in place. And what I found was that after we squared off and removed that hoof wall, the force on the foot went up considerably in that same area that we were looking on the sole. Then we blended in the coronary band up to the toe, and the force went up a little bit more. This is the horse's foot after we unfortunately euthanized her. She was an old horse, and this was not necessarily a bad thing for her. But you can see we really haven't invaded the hoof capsule too much. We've really just moved the foot back to the white line right here. And this is what was going on inside the foot. You can see that obviously now you can really see that we haven't made the rotation go away. Here's our stratum internum. We've really taken off about half the thickness of the hoof wall, and this is the area that we were looking at, is the force that was basically under the area of the tip of the coffin bone, and you can see that there is some hemorrhage in there, which suggests that taking some pressure off there might be a reasonable thing to do. This is a different horse right here. We basically did the same trial on, but we did do the added step at the end of trying to restore the integrity of the hoof capsule through the use of hoof repair techniques. In this case, it's carbon fiber and Kevlar saturated with an acrylic adhesive. And what you see here are the two graphs that represent the force on the foot right here before we did the hoof wall repair, and this is what it was after. So in that same area of the foot, we lessened some of the force on the foot. To me, the take-home message out of this is a little bit of what we've seen in other ways, that we can compromise the integrity of the hoof capsule through our trimming techniques, and second, that we can use some reinforcement techniques, use of glue-on shoes, the use of fabrics, to replace some of that integrity of the hoof capsule that we're removing. I think in some ways, how does this relate to glue in itself? I think one of the mistakes we make is that we think about glue. Glue is an adhesive. The fibers that we put in there and the fabrics that we mix in with that lend to additional strength. The best example I can give you is concrete. Concrete's strong. If you add rebar to it, you've strengthened it. And to me, the fabrics that we put in are akin to rebar and have a positive effect on replacing some of the integrity of the hoof capsule. They allow me to trim that foot a bit more aggressively. And we found this in another way. This was another project that we looked on, a comparison of horses wearing the Sigafoos shoe for a period of a year. And what we did was follow this along with 118 other horses that we followed for a period of a year and looked at the amount of distortion that they had in the toe and found that they had 50% less distortion in horses that had glue-on shoes compared to the horses that had nail-on shoes. All right, so here's a second case, and this is another thoroughbred horse, obviously with some foot issues, and these foot issues have been going on for a long time. This is not, I'm not throwing any farriers under the bus on here, quite, I'll say, quite responsibly, I guess I can say. I've seen a lot of very, very talented farriers struggle with trying to maintain hoof integrity in a horse that just doesn't have any hoof capsule integrity. That's a real, potential problem. It's very difficult to manage every foot for every horse's use and in every environment. Before the trim, you can see bruising right here on the sole, and this is bruising in the exact same area that we were just studying with my in-shoe force measuring system. We also have bruising back in this area, back over here. We have a little bit of an abscess in the lateral heel of the other foot. With apologies to all the cotton, this horse came in basically wrapped up in cotton, trying to give it any kind of protection in there. And there were no shoes on when she walked in the door. This horse has just had too many problems, and they had suspected that the shoes were problems, so they took it off. So there's more evidence of the bruising. This type of attempt at repairing feet, you're better off not doing it. I mean, it never makes a difference. There's no integrity in glue that's that thin. If anything, you might be trapping more moisture in behind that repair and actually softening the hoof wall and doing more harm than good. If you really wanted to nail a shoe onto this foot and then turn around and take a piece of fabric, saturate it in glue, and put it on the surface of it, I think that could make some sense. But I would turn around and say, I think you can be a bit more, I think there are better ways of doing it. I think gluing a shoe on is a better choice for managing this. You can see all the distortion in here, dishing in the toe, even though farriers attempted to bring the breakover point back. And again, to use Jeff Ridley's analogy, this is my idea of carving a wooden Indian out of a tree stump. This is trying to make, removing all the distortion from this foot, trying to get back to a reasonable starting point. The difficulty is, if you do this, you've really limited the amount of hoof that you have to apply a shoe to. You've really thinned out the hoof wall because you've taken out a lot of the distorted tissue in there. I should also point out, I know there are a lot of farriers out there, and Jeff alluded to this as well. He takes pride in his traditional aspect of his work. I totally get that. I also look at this and think, at some point, I'm not going to try and convince anybody to glue on shoes instead of nailing them on. But at some point, why do you have to go to the extremes of trying to, give this horse 6 weeks and try and get this horse, somewhere to grow in there, when we do have other options? Could I, potentially find a place to put a nail in this foot? Yes, but we know we already have all this traumatized sole in here, and I'm going to do everything I can to try and take some of the force off of that area. So this is what the horse looked like when it left, and within a couple of weeks, this horse was much more comfortable and back doing some light work. So I think that's a pretty indicative. Those are the two cases I've presented so far are pretty typical of the cases that come into New Bolton Center and the cases that I'm presented with. Here we have a toe crack, and as I mentioned before, heat does have a potential to create an issue. The last thing in the world I would want to do is take 60 degrees centigrade adhesive and pack it in there, up against some of this sensitive tissue. That's, even if you don't create an infection sealing it all in there, you have a really good chance of thermally damaging some of the tissues that are underneath it. The way I kind of get around some of this, in this particular case, I just made a little plug, almost like a little cone out of impression material to line that defect. This is Kevlar, which I've saturated with an acrylic adhesive and laid over this defect. I've wet out the foot over here and protected the coronary band with a little bit of tape. And then I'm going to come back, and after this is all set up and everything is glued in place, I'm just going to take a pair of pliers and just pull out this impression material to leave a hollow cavity. Now we have the benefits of stability of that horse's foot, protection that's in there, and we've also done it in a way where we haven't had to seal up the foot and trap things in here. Here's another hoof crack. Similar kind of thing. Even with this particular type of defect, I'm not going to debride every bit of hoof out of here until I get down to solid attachment. You could lose half the foot before you find that you get to that point. What I've found works pretty well is to take generally the white part of impression material, just one half of the impression material. Silicone base, it's something that live tissue tolerates very well. I've mixed in some copper sulfate as an antibacterial, antifungal agent, and I'm going to leave this in place. It's not going to polymerize. It's going to stay in its putty form. So if there are any areas of pressure, or if I need to go back and open this up, we can do that at any point. But now I've just kind of taken this. Now I have a layer of Kevlar and a layer of carbon fiber over the surface of this, and I've glued a shoe on. Here you can see a little bit of the copper sulfate still extending out the top. Should this horse have any infection issues, I can go right down here and cut a little opening down here and still have everything in place, or even just go through and cut these out. But this horse has done well in its time frame right here. This is another technique that we use with glue-on shoes. There's a really good study that came out of the Japanese Racing Association looking at the effect of direct glue-on shoes on heel movement in horses. It was really cool. When horses move, this was studied on horses on a treadmill, glue-on shoes not only restricted the amount of expansion that takes place, but they also restricted some of the contraction of a horse's foot. And there are times when you really want to do that. If you have a major loss of stability in a horse's foot or a coffin bone fracture, it can be really beneficial to try and bind this whole horse's foot together so that we have a good stable unit. In this case, with using the Sigafoos shoe, I mean, I have horses that I've used this for years, and I don't get the sense that we've really constricted this foot. I don't see that limited in terms of the expansion and contraction. So what we've done in cases where we're looking to find added stability, coffin bone fractures, is actually just take a little piece of fabric, a strip of fabric, and just run it directly around the bottom of the foot. So we're just running it around the heel bulbs and staying distal to the coronary band. Here's another case right here where we have a hoof wall avulsion. Oops. So this is one you can see radiographically, this whole big piece of foot that's torn away up here. And we have all this tissue up here that we have to look at. This is all stuff that's, as Jeff pointed out with his avulsion talk, this has been going on for a long period of time, and there's absolutely no benefit to trying to reattach this piece. Not every case needs to be repaired. There was enough integrity in this horse's foot so that we could actually just keep all the pressure off of that, leave everything open and dry so we could treat it. And cutting out the center of the foot like here, it still leaves an awful lot of attachment and a lot of stability. I have horses without issues that have raced in partial cuffs like this. Thoroughbreds racing the horse at the track, or event horses doing upper level eventing without a full cuff on there. Another one of the advantages of this is it's kind of like using a partial pad. If you have a foot that's suffering from too much moisture, leaving a good section of this toe open lets a lot more moisture out, and it helps to maintain. If you're experiencing problems because the glue-on shoes are making the horse's foot too moist, cut out the whole center of the toe right here. You'll probably still have enough to stabilize the shoe on the foot for a 6 or 7 week period, and let some moisture out at the same point. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Foal shoes in here. With this right here, what we see, these are the old tab shoes. I don't think anybody really had great luck with those. This is an ibex shoe, and those work very well. The trouble is, you need to carry a large number of material. You need to have a lot of stock in different sizes to fit a lot of different problems. So what we've done is to look at a little different way. This is a little different process that we use. Here's a foal with a bit of a club foot. You see his foot is up in the air. This horse had an inferior check ligament surgery. And all I do is lightly sand the foot. I am not using solvents to prepare for glue-on shoes. I am surface, cleaning the foot so that I have a fresh, clean surface. I just go over it with the fine side of a rasp or a sanding block, and that's generally enough to get good attachment of the shoe. I'll take a little piece of aluminum, cut out a couple of holes in place, and this is the radiograph of the horse we were just looking at. What I'm really trying to get out of this is a bit of a reverse wedge, since we have some phalangeal misalignment right here. We have a little bit of a flexural limb issue going on. So I'm going to use impression material to make a bit of a reverse wedge, and the holes that I drilled in the bottom of this plate are going to help to anchor my plate in place. Now I'm just going to take a strip of fabric, just anything that's abrasion resistant. Spectra cloth works well, Vectran not quite as well. Saturate about a 6-inch long piece of fabric, wrap it around the outside of the foot, getting glue all over myself right here, and then just saran wrap it in place. And this is what we're left with when you come back after 5 minutes. Now I've got my own little custom fit cuff shoe, and on the bottom of the foot we just have the fabric. Now he's probably going to wear through the toe up here in the front, but we generally have enough stability, and I'm usually leaving Foal shoes on for no more than 2 or 3 weeks at a time because their feet are so they're ever changing. They're such a fragile little foot that you try not to leave a shoe on for as long as we would for a more adult horse. Here's another foal. This one has some laxity issues. We're going to put some heel extensions on this. I've traced out the foot on a piece of cardboard, transferred that to a piece of aluminum, and just traced it out. Here are my materials, which is some polyester braided material right here. Gloves. Here's my acrylic adhesive right here. Some saran wrap and a couple of mixing tools and a sanding block. I'm going to use, in this case, a little bit of super fast, just creating a little bead to help hold this in place on a temporary basis. I probably like using the impression material more since it really does seem to three-dimensionally lock the foot in place, but this is another one that works well. So I'm picking up this foal's foot. I've got my plate, now I'm pressing that in place, and that sets up very quickly. Now I'm taking my little fabric cuff, wrapping it around the foot, and these work really well. I mean, this foal is not sedated. He's well behaved, I'll grant you that, but this is something that's just really, it's not that big a deal from a from a farrier point of view. The foal doesn't mind too much any more than they mind getting a little bit of a foot wrap placed on there. Mom's standing there. We're just doing this in a stall right outside the farrier shop at New Bolton Center. You can see I've already got the shoe on the other foot, so we're, they set up very quickly. We can put everything in place. A lot of times with foals, I'll hold their feet up for a little bit of time. This is her walking out of the stall 10 minutes later. So this foal that was really walking, on its heel bulbs, still very low in the pasterns, but she's now walking on the bottom of the foot. As I tell my vet students, that's about the only universal rule you can have in the farrier world. You have to walk on the bottom of your feet. We put these shoes on her a couple of times. So a month later, she basically grew right out of this. And a lot of times, laxity works out pretty well, and they tend to fix themselves pretty well. That's a pretty cheap, inexpensive, easy, affordable way to go about, using a foal shoe. And it's a lot easier than having to order a whole bunch of different size materials. This is one of my long-term clients, a horse named Desmond, who I love dearly. Desmond just had his 50th visit into New Bolton Center. I've taken care of his feet now for about the last 6 years since I moved down here. And to me, this is again another one of the reasons that I like the Sigafoos shoe, and that is that I can use these shoes on horses for a long period of time and not have to worry about whether or not there's going to be any deleterious effect of the foot over a long, with the direct glue shoes. I tend to have luck for maybe about 2 or 3 shoeings, and after that, you start seeing bruising on the foot. I don't know all the reasons why, and maybe that's a problem that's unique to me. But with the Sigafoos shoe, I can put them on for long periods of time. And I mentioned earlier, this is what happens if you put glue-on shoes on for 50 visits. Who says dressage people don't have a sense of humor? This was Desmond's feet a while ago. This was him at last Halloween. A little bit of dye and some black paint, and a client who was willing to play around a little bit. That's the end of what I have prepared here, but as I said earlier, if anyone has specific questions, I'll do what I can to try and answer them. I'd be happy to answer any questions and pull out some other photos if you have specific requests.
Okay, great. Well, Pat, I was going to have you pull up one of the more extreme dye jobs you've done for Dean Richardson, but no need to now with the jack-o'-lantern feet.
Yeah, one of my rules is, especially when working with a surgeon, it's important to remind them that the farrier ultimately always has the last word. So every now and then I take Dr. Richardson's horse, and I think my favorite was inserting a little bit of rhinestones and bling in there. I had the students shoe his horse, and that was what they came up with.
Okay. All right, we have a few questions already. Again, if you have any questions or would maybe like to try to challenge Pat with a case study, feel free to type that into the question field. Let's begin with this one. What do you see are the negatives of using the direct glue-on approach with just the shoe, no cuff?
Well, as I said, I do think there have been some studies that show that it changes how the foot deforms. And I wonder if that's some of the reasons why, like I said, start seeing bruising back in the heel region after 2 or 3 shoeings. The good news is they stay on really well. And, most of us have some sort of aluminum shoes in the truck anyway. It doesn't really take, if you have, either acrylic or vet-tech adhesives in there, they do stay on really well. They're not difficult to apply. I just don't think that they're as good a long-term solution. They're definitely less expensive. And I think that's another good testament for it, since finances always play a role in what we're applying to horses' feet. I mean, a lot of times, I'm very lucky to work in the East Coast where finances are not $300 or $400 dollar shoeing job is not considered to be outrageous. In other parts of the country, I know, or certainly in the world, those are not going to be commonplace. So I'm fortunate to work where I do. That's one of the big differences, I'd say, advantages in there for the direct glue method.
Okay. Here's a question asking for advice. What type of glue-on solution would you recommend for a toe extension on a 6-month-old club-footed quarter foal?
Well, at 6 months, first of all, I wouldn't necessarily just use a toe extension in and of itself. I think, especially if you have a dish that's already started there, kills me to say this, but farriers can't fix everything, and occasionally surgeons do have a really good role in there. I mean, sometimes an inferior check ligament desmotomy might be, a better solution than a toe extension shoe by itself. And a lot of times I'm really reluctant to put extensions on foals because you really can make things a lot worse. And at 6 months, you're kind of in that in-between phase. Ideally, a lot of them would have resolved by now if they've been receiving some regular care. But But I think I showed you a couple of, excuse me, different ways in there towards the end of putting aluminum plate, and you can just fit that in and just leave a toe extension out the front. A lot of times also using, at least these horses that have clubfoot also have a broken forward axis. You can almost make a little bit of a reverse wedge in there, assuming that the mechanics will allow that there's not so much tension on the deep flexor tendon that you're going to create a different issue.
Okay. This question refers to an image you had earlier. What's the type of pad that you use there in the farrier shop, the floor mat?
Oh, yeah, that's actually a bit of a bummer. We've been, there's a company called Easy Mat Light that makes trailer mats. They're very low density mats. Apparently they've gone out of business. We're having a hard time finding them. Not only do we use those when we stand horses in the farrier shop, but we've actually been bedding horses with foot-related problems, supporting limb potential cases, laminitis cases. Bedding a stall with them and then having some pretty favorable results. I can tell you it definitely makes a difference even on my feet standing on them, and the horses really do. We've had a couple of horses where we've just bed, one 12-foot by 4-foot mat in the stall and find that the horse is always standing on that half of the stall. I really do think that can be a nice way to, again, it's not always about the feet. A lot of times I think as farriers we tend to forget about the substrate, what they're working on or what they're standing on. The soft stall mats can really be a lifesaver.
Okay. So in your typical setting, what kind of preparation do you like the best? Do you prefer, say, using a heat gun? What are the sort of circumstances that you prefer and often use?
When I'm using a cuff shoe, as I said, I really just go over the foot until I have a clean, dry surface. It's hard to put these on when you're standing outside shoeing horses in the rain. I've done it. I don't recommend it. I think when you're dealing with the solar, bonding to the solar surface of the foot, it's a little bit more temperamental. You have to be more fastidious in caring for the foot, making sure that it's dry. A lot of times I just use a little torch on the bottom of a horse's foot just to flame the foot, go over it once or twice to get a lot of the surface moisture out before bonding to the sole. But the majority of time I'm bonding to the outer hoof wall, to the dorsal surface of the foot with a cuff shoe, and just a clean, dry surface, no solvents. I think a lot of early on in the use of glue-on shoes, everybody was using solvents for these, and I think we may not understand all the science well enough. In fact, the engineers that were involved with the company that makes the glue made the comment they don't know why this glue works. The acrylics work on horses' feet. It should be way down the list of things that actually work out well for horses for this type of use. But it does seem to work. And without using solvents, the glue still does seem to bond well to the horse's foot, at least in my experience.
Okay. Do you think spacers are necessary if 5 or 6 3/8 inch drill holes are drilled into the shoe to act as anchors?
I think there are a lot of different ways of doing it. I've done it both ways. I've had success. I think sometimes the spacers can be a little thick for my liking. There are other alternatives in there as well. One of the things that I've used quite a bit are little glass beads. You can get glass beads of different diameters that you can mix into the glue. And the advantage to that is that will actually act as a spacer in itself. Instead of having them in a couple of different locations, they're just all the way through the glue, so you just physically can't compress the glass beads. And I think there's some potential for that, in terms of being another way of managing it. I'm not sure I answered the question really well in there. I think the mechanical hole, drilling holes in the shoe definitely help, but you still need some bond line thickness in your adhesive.
Is long-term use of a Sigafoos shoe detrimental in hoof expansion?
I haven't seen it. I just haven't. It's not like I have horses that start out in a size 2 shoe and a year later they're wearing a size 1. I don't see that type of change. I actually talked to Dr. Casano from the Japanese Racing Association. I begged him to do the same trial looking at heel movement in horses with the Sigafoos shoe, because I think with the urethane pad on there, the foot is still expanding and contracting. Obviously, I can't prove that. I don't have that technology that I can actually measure heel movement. But I think with the urethane pad in there, there's still a lot of movement in the horse's foot, and they just don't seem to contract in my hands the same way I see, with some other, with a direct glue where you're really locking things together.
Okay. So let's you have ideal conditions where you work, Pat. Is a
Yeah,
glue-on shoe realistic, say in that backyard setting where you're working in uneven, wet, cold? I guess maybe what advice would you have for using glue-ons in the less than ideal circumstances?
I I've had a bunch of instances in the last few years where I turn around and look at my vet students and say, I need to chronicle this moment so people know that I'm not working in this situation all the time. I think the big thing with glue on shoes, like I said, I've done it outside in the rain, I've done it in the mud, I've done it in 10 below weather. I think the fact that I've got thousands of prior experiences with it make those easier. I guess my advice would be, especially when you're starting in this, try and line stuff up in your favor. If you've got a horse that you don't know how they're going to behave, have some sedation there, or have a vet there to sedate the horse in the event that you need it. Try and start in better situations. If you're working in cold conditions, put the glue in your truck and let the defroster run for a while and bring it up to temperature before you start working with it. Or if you're working in, really hot environments, put it in an air-conditioned spot, or use, if it's in a sealed container, depending on what your packaging is, run it in cool water so that it cools down. Give yourself the best starting point so that you have the best early experiences with them, and then you learn your way around that. Then you can figure out all the ways of working in suboptimal conditions.
Okay. Do you on average charge more for gluing on shoes versus nailing on shoes? And maybe for this one, Pat, you could address this from two angles: the angle
Yeah.
of working in a vet setting, vet hospital setting, the school setting, and also
Yes.
maybe what you would do as an independent farrier.
Yeah. It's funny. I was listening to Jeff's presentation, and I thought Jeff did a great job. Um, Jeff made the point of charging for your time, and the hard part of working in a hospital setting, Jeff alluded to this, there's a lot of standing around and waiting. There's a lot of standing around while the horse goes to radiology. There's a lot of time standing around when the veterinarian's examining the horse. And those are things that you just can't skip. I was thinking how lucky I am that I bounce back and forth between 3 of those clients that are in the same situation, so I'm not as losing as much time. This is kind of when you hit the point where you're working in hospitals all the time. That really does help it make it a more effective use of your time because you're not standing around waiting. The next question was, do we charge more for glue-on shoes than nail-on shoes? Yes, we do. I will say that there are a couple of things that I've done over the years that, and I could recount a story. I actually had Bernie Chapman in for a conference, and I'm certainly not picking on Bernie when I say this, but the way he shot the horse, he basically said, I'm gonna pull out the smallest nails and the lightest aluminum shoe. I'm gonna nail it on this horse and hope that in 6 weeks there's more to work with. Like I said, there are people that I've seen that have. I know Bernie's a great farrier. I've seen that so many people that are really great farriers that have a hard time managing these. That I looked at it and said, the good part is it's not just me. And if I'm going to work in a therapeutic center, I want to give myself the best chance of being successful. So initially, I tried to keep the prices on glue-on shoes manageable. I'm not saying they were inexpensive. I'm not saying I didn't make money on it. I'm saying I tried to keep it priced in a way that I got to use them regularly. Because the more you use them, the better you get, the faster you get, and in my case, I'll say the better the outcome that I was seeing. And if I have something that works really well, I try not to price it in a way that I, can't use it. If I can't afford to use it, then it doesn't help out a whole lot of horses. So, don't cheat yourself, too much. But I also know some farriers that probably price glue-on shoes in such a way so that they don't have to use them. They're almost pricing them in a way so that they don't have to, I don't want to use them. If I price them that high, at least it'll be worth my while. I kind of looked at it the other way, and I can shoe a horse in much less time, especially some of these problem cases, much less time with a pair of glue-on shoes than a pair of nail-on shoes now.
Okay, we got one more question. So looking at your cuff approach, how soon after you remove the saran wrap are you comfortable with that horse being turned out?
Oh, good question. And I didn't really address this well. The glue reaches about 80% of its cure strength in the first hour. So what we usually tell people is you can ride the horse, in a couple of hours if it's an adult. If it's a foal, I would say keep them in and locked up. The big thing is the polymerization is ongoing for the first 20 hours or so, 24 hours. What I usually recommend to clients is take the horse home, put it in a stall, leave it in overnight. Tomorrow morning you can do your regular thing. The big part really being keep the horse's foot dry for the first 24 hours. I will also tell you that if you're working on a therapeutic case and you've got things like betadine, the iodine in betadine solution interferes with the cross-polymerization matrix of the polymethyl methacrylate. It makes me sound like I know what I'm doing, but that's a direct quote from Rob Sigafoos, who really did know what he's doing. Certain things like iodine solution interfere with the polymerization process of glue. And you have to be careful of some things like that. That's one of the reasons you want to make sure that you have a really clean surface. If you're working on a horse after it's had some sort of foot surgery or preparation, take the time to sand the foot again, otherwise your shoe is not going to stay on quite as well.